Thousands and thousands of young Americans.
1945. The war has ended. The 6 years long war that claimed more than 70 million lives alarmed those who survived to create a new world order that would prevent such a cataclysm from ever happening again. As such, the victors of the war jointly established the new international order on the basis of collective security and reconciliation, in the hope for long-lasting peace. But that hope was short-lived, for once again, the world was plunged into another competition for global dominance, now between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, beginning the 5 decades long period called the Cold War era. In this video, we will explore the nature of the international order during 1945 to 1990 through a book written by Ian J. Clarke, The Hierarchy of States. In the book, he describes the development of the international order during the Cold War era with the phrase, "from concert to balance." But what does it mean though? By the definitions from ETIM Online, concert means an agreement of two or more parties in design or plan. And balance means an equilibrium, a state of one side cultivating another. So the phrase "from concert to balance" in IR context can mean as something similar to the shift from an effort to compromise between great powers to the competition between them, seeking to deter and counterweight each other. And if we look into the chain of events during this period, we will realize that the international diplomatic order, economic or military, will fall into this pattern. The great powers failed to continue the post-war cooperation as their animosity kept arising, and the only thing that kept them from a direct confrontation was the fear of nuclear annihilation. Not to mention that they couldn't even secure their relations with the bloc's members. And now, let's dig deep into the components of the post-war international order. UN during the Cold War. Perception toward the UN and other established international organizations are varied. For realists, these establishments are merely channels for great powers to exercise their dominance. For idealists, these organizations are the signs of hope and incoming changes for the world community. But if we ask Johan and I, their perceptions on the topic will be: in the world of multiple issues imperfectly linked, in which coalitions are formed transnationally and transgovernmentally, the potential role of international institutions in political bargaining is greatly increased. In particular, they help set the international agenda and act as catalysts for coalition formation and as arenas for political initiatives and linkage for weak states. In short, like most idealists, they view the UN and transnational institutions as the mechanism for the world community to reconcile, cooperate, and to jointly set and follow the same agendas. Despite their different views, UN analysts have a consensus on the evolution phases of the UN, which are: the first phase, from 1945 to 1950, when the foundation of the UN was overtaken by the outbreak of the Cold War. The UN Charter, originally created to support the continuation of the cooperation between the winning great powers after the war. By the formation of the UN Security Council, the great powers, as permanent members, can be ensured that their decision-making power over international issues can be maintained, coupled with the veto power if they don't agree on any resolution, and thus, the international order and collective security are assured. We can realize that the UN is based on some principles. First, that the major powers have a firm responsibility to oversee security matters. And the second, that the UN should not be used against any distant great powers, which the latter, however, failed to be committed in the following period. The second phase, Korean War, when the UN became an instrument of Western policy. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, The Soviet Union strongly opposed the UN's intervention into the conflict and used its veto power against Security Council's resolutions on Korea. As such, the United States proposed the Uniting Peace Resolution to bypass the Security Council and asking the General Assembly for security measure, which technically this attempt is the violation of the UN Charter, but because the majority of the UN at that time was Western allied nations, the resolution was eventually passed. The UN then illegally intervened in the war, and such action was condemned by the Soviet Union, calling the UN a tool of the West. And the third and current phase, the expansion and the end of Western hegemony. From the mid-1950s onward, the UN saw a great expansion as it accepted new members, which are mostly newly independent nations. Because those nations are mostly non-allied nations, the Western Bloc also lost their hegemony over the organization. As these new members usually abstain or oppose the resolution which favor the West, and this trend is ongoing to this day. The International Economic Order. From the 70s, the international community began to emphasize on economy rather than traditional issues like military. But what are the factors that drive the economy to be a front row issue? The answer is the awareness of environmental issues and the scarcity of resources. In 1972, when the Club of Rome, an NGO focusing on climate change, issued Limits to Growth, it warned that the world is shifting toward the scarcity of resources parallel with the rapidly increasing world populations and called for the change in economic policies. An experience from the October 1973 oil crisis also raised international arguments on the gradual reduction of resources. The uneven development in the global economy is another factor. In 1975, roughly 75% of all multinational corporations' investment were placed in developed countries. Many economic experts say that the deregulated economic order is to blame. So, let's take a closer look to the structure of the economic order. The post-war economic order is based on two major pillars, a financial pillar and a trading pillar. The financial pillar stands the Bretton Woods system. In the 1944 conference, the IMF and World Bank were established to oversee international finance and exchange rate. To stabilize the global economy, the gold exchange standard was introduced. The concept was to peg the US dollar to gold price and other currencies pegged to the US dollar. But the heavy deficit and inflation caused by the Marshall Plan and the Vietnam War forced the US to change the policy. The Nixon shock in 1971 cancelled the gold standard convertibility, the freely floating fiat system introduced and being used ever since. For trade pillar, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade was signed in 1948 to reduce trade barriers. However, the free trade hurt American economy with a huge deficit. The Nixon shock 10% surcharge on imports was the first sign of protectionism caused by trade imbalance, followed by trade wars between Japan, Europe, and the US throughout the 1980s. The wealth gap between the developed and developing nations kept widening. So, the UNCTAD was established to help the developing nations to expand their trade capabilities and increase bargaining power for them, so as to guide them in a fierce competition between themselves for a share in the first world market. International economic order itself has included elements of both concert and balanced strategies. While the market-led mechanism itself always benefits the powerful economy, the established financial institutions are also devised and managed by the same small group of industrialized states. However, it must be remembered that because of the interdependency of the global economy, those institutions are bound to manage things in favor of all economic participants, large or small. Nevertheless, as the neoliberal ideas favor deregulated trade and minimize governmental interventions are increasingly popular among the first world states. It leaves a small space for international institutions to create equity in the already unequal global economy. So,
the inequality will keep widening and expanding. The impact of the global development of nuclear weapons, due to its destructive power, to actually employ one would only lead to annihilation. Nuclear weapons were only used for the display of military capability. There has been a change of emphasis from the use of war to the threat of war. It is possible to argue that this had led to the militarization of international political processes, because ultimately the threat of nuclear war underlies any conflict between superpowers. The line between war and peace is now blurred. Even though there are constant threats of war, it also had the consequence of fostering the establishment of greater political restraints over war itself. The sole purpose of the military force is no longer physical coercion, but an attempt to affect the intentions of the opponent through putting psychological pressures. As for the case of the first and only physical use of nuclear weapon in warfare, in 1945, it can be argued that the real targets were not Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the politicians in Tokyo themselves. In order to create a stable nuclear relationship between themselves, the superpowers have sought to create certain foundations of credible deterrence over the years. The United States and the Soviet Union seem to subscribe to the notion that mutual vulnerability was an essential condition of stable deterrence. So we ended up having the Strategic Arms Limitation Talk, or SALT. SALT 1 in 1969 and SALT 2 in 1979. And SALT 1 led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM. Possession of nuclear weaponry has emphasized the hierarchical dimension of international society, creating a new category of have and have-not states. It might be considered that nuclear weaponry has created a precondition of a successful concert system, since such system depends upon the existence of an elite grouping of powers with shared interest in managing the system and with the capability to do so. In practice, however, beyond the hardworking attempt to check the further proliferation of nuclear weapons, the nuclear powers have been too divided by disagreements on other areas to be able to give the system a concerted direction. Indeed, it has been suggested that the seemingly stability of nuclear relationship could have actually hindered the further efforts to develop more formalized concert or security system. Simply put, it was concerted in the sense that the shared goal of the superpowers is to control the use of nuclear weaponry, but also obstructed the further development of a formalized concert. From an optimistic point of view, superpowers can be seen as custodians of the international order. Superpowers diffuse pre-existing regional tensions and introduce stability by the exercise of their hegemonial roles within their spheres of influence. But this raises the question, what is the difference between imperialism and spheres of influence? We must first look at the definition of imperialism. The policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, especially by direct territorial acquisition, or by gaining indirect control over political or economic life of other areas. Between the year 1880 to 1900, it was the height of imperialistic activity. We saw annexation and partition of overseas territories by European powers, but not necessarily. Britain in Burma, France in Indochina, Germany in the Pacific, United States in Philippines and Hawaii, Japan in Korea and later China, Russia in Central Asia, and Africa was basically a cake. But in the post-1945 world, we saw a breakup of former colonial empires. The British withdrew from India and Southeast Asia. The Dutch were expelled from Indonesia, the French from Indochina, and the US granted the Philippines independence, and new African countries were gaining statehood. But despite the end of the colonial era, the term imperialism was still used frequently and is still used today. However, it was used as criticism or insult rather than imperialism in the classical sense. Sphere of influence, by definition, is the claim by a state to exclusive or predominant control over a foreign area or territory. As you can see, these two can be very similar by definition. In some ways, it can be argued that spheres of influence would be one technique for exercising imperialism. Something like intervention is an element in both imperialism and spheres of influence. We saw proxy wars like the Soviet in Afghanistan, America in Vietnam, or Cuba, Angola, Nicaragua, or Cambodia. We also had the superpowers' military support, such as arms supplies in the Middle East in the 70s or the Horn of Africa. But something that's unique in the modern day of age is humanitarian interventions. While both imperialism and spheres of influence aim to establish dominance over regions or state, the clearest and perhaps simplest distinction between the two is, as the name suggests, the goal of spheres of influence are for superpowers to influence other states in decision-making processes or other affairs, rather than seeking direct control over those states' territories. All in all, we have seen a shift from concert to balance from the beginning to the end of the Cold War. At first, in the post-war society, there was an attempt of concert among states. But as the arms race and nuclear deterrence progressed, superpowers emerged, namely the United States and the Soviet Union. It became a balance of power between the two. It's fair to say that there had been more cooperation in later years, like the Détente during Nixon's presidency, but the bipolarity of the international order remained until the end of the 20th century.